My name is Scott Smith, and I'm a partner at Gowling WLG, speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.
My name is Jessica George, and I'm an associate at Gowling WLG. Gowling WLG is home to one of the largest and most respected Indigenous law practices in Canada, and we are proud sustaining partners of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition.
We are also sponsors of FNMPC's upcoming Towards Net Zero by 2050 conference, taking place April 25th and 26th, online and in person at the Westin Bayshore in Vancouver, Canada. At Gowling WLG, we recognize the importance of Indigenous participation in major infrastructure developments and illuminating the Indigenous perspectives concerning ESG investment standards.
Today's Indigenous Women in Sustainable Finance and Business event will spotlight prominent Indigenous women across Canada and the US who are leading sustainable finance, ESG, and net zero business solutions. They have gathered today to ignite meaningful conversations around advancing the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples, building value for society, and working to save our planet.
Thank you for joining today's important conversation. I will now turn the program over to today's event host, Sherry Brandt, partner and national leader of Indigenous law at Borden Ladner Gervais LLP. Over to you, Sherry.
All right. Hello, everybody. And it is such a pleasure to be here. My name is Sherry Brandt. I am the partner at Borden Ladner Gervais in the commercial group, but I also lead the Indigenous law practice. And more recently, I'm proud to say that I joined the board of TD Bank, and I also sit on the board of Hydro One Networks. And I also have the privilege of coming to you today from my home community, Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. And so I'm here today to kick off this session. Really excited about the terrific speakers that we have for us today. And really I want to kick off with talking about our recent announcements and how we're seeing that the world has changed. You know, we all went to COP26. We have 196 countries that have signed this critical agreement to work towards a warning limit of 1.5 degrees. And this is critical. This is in the Paris Agreement, and this is mission critical for us globally. We're all going to have to figure out how to work together, how to decarbonize, how we're going to move away from the status quo. And we're really going to have to look to all sectors, not just oil and gas, but to the building sector, to industries, to transportation, to the energy sector. We're going to have to see how we'll electrify and do that in a responsible way. And so we have a lot ahead of us. And today we are joined by our guest speakers who are fearless Indigenous women who know how to encounter changes to the status quo. And so when I think of our great three speakers that we have here today, they come from the legal side, they come from public administration, they come from engineering, and they're all looking to transition to understand this new space and are looking to our sustainable business and finance sectors as an important area and how we can work together collaboratively. Now, before I introduce our incredible speakers and get into our discussion, I would also like to thank the First Nations Major Projects Coalition sustaining partners. That's CIBC, Collier's Project Leaders, Cowie, Gowling's WLG, and New Gold for all supporting our discussion today. And so today is about Indigenous women leadership in this net zero transition. We're going to hear from our speakers on sustainable finance and business, specifically on some models into net zero and their views on what is sustainable finance, and really start to unpack ESG from an Indigenous perspective. So without further ado, I'm going to get the conversation going, and we're going to start with our first guest, Jamie Lickers. Jamie Lickers is the Vice President of Indigenous Markets at CIBC. Welcome, Jamie. It's so good to see you. It's been a while, and really pleased that we're able to be here on this session today. And I look forward to seeing you in person at April at our conference. So
That's
listen,
great.
let's
Thanks,
get into
Sheree.
it.
It's nice to see you again as well.
No, this is great. Look, you've changed your role, and we're talking about transition. So why don't you tell us about that? What's prompted that transition for you?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to chat about my recent move career-wise, and it was so nice to see. I won't say my old friends because neither of them are old, but my friends from Gowlings, Scott and Jessica, and obviously, Sheree, you and I know each other from my previous career as a lawyer, as a partner at Gowlings, and formerly the head of the National Indigenous Practice Group there. And I joke now that I'm a recovering lawyer, although I'm not really sure that you ever fully recover from being a lawyer. So I'm continuing to work on that every day. But as you know, my practice when I was at Gowlings really focused in the Indigenous trust and wealth generation space. So I had the great privilege of working on behalf of many nations and Indigenous communities across the country as they planned for their future, as they created structures to manage the wealth of their nation for the good of their communities, both today and tomorrow. And in my work in that Indigenous trust space, I came to know a lot of people in, of course, the trust and the business and the finance space, as well as the investment management space. And for about a decade, I stood on this soapbox, as I like to call it, preaching about how great the demand was for more Indigenous people in the finance space. And when CIBC approached me, I thought, well, wouldn't that be rich for all of these presentations I've given and all of the times I've said we need more Indigenous people to go into finance, to change issues for Indigenous communities across the country, to break down barriers and create increased access to capital. Like, how do I now say no when presented with this opportunity? So that's kind of how it came to be. And, here I am, and every day I kind of pretend to be a banker now.
That's great. Listen, I'm super excited for you, super excited for the journey. And this is just the beginning, right, for everything that you're looking to do at CIBC. So listen, you mentioned access to capital. So maybe just elaborate on that, how you see that from your perspective now.
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. Sadly, it's not a new issue to anyone who works in either the Indigenous legal or the Indigenous finance space, or the business space for that matter. We all know that there are various pieces of legislation that are outdated, paternalistic, and restrictive in terms of the regimes that apply to Indigenous communities across the country, and particularly to nations as bans under the Indian Act. And one of those most harmful restrictions, in my view, is the limitation under the Indian Act for the ability of nations to use their on-reserve property as security for lending and financing. And so, every day I see incredibly economically dynamic nations that are looking to grow and diversify their economies that are severely limited by these restrictions. And it really impacts, from a lending perspective, right? When we're looking at financing, when we're presented with an opportunity to assist any client, when we're evaluating that opportunity, we're looking at two key metrics, and those are debt serviceability and security for the underlying value of the financing. And in many cases, we see nations that have absolutely no issue with debt service capabilities, but are severely restricted on the security side because of those restrictive elements of pieces of legislation like the Indian Act. And of course, they're limited in ways that other communities and other governments are not, which really creates an unfair economic ground for nations.
Yeah, no, this is a point that's near and dear to me as well. But just thinking about this in the context of net zero, there's a couple points that I want to talk about with you on this. But just thinking about the parallels to net zero, and seeing this impossible task, seeing the need in my mind, and from what I hear from lots of different sources, is what's going to be the need to collaborate. What I was really interested in trying to see on the net zero side is, people are saying we're going to have to come up with innovative financing solutions in order to address the challenges to, support the innovations in the market that are going to get us to greenhouse gas reduction. To do this innovation, it can't just be the market. We can't just look at banks either, who are focused, as you say, on those solid metrics, which are focused around return and sustainability for the bank and its initiatives. Right? Something's got to give. And I think it's really interesting. And when we look at our Indigenous business leaders, and now you in finance, how great is it to be fully equipped with dealing with barriers, right? Seeing those barriers and seeing the need that we're going to need to come up with some creative solutions. So I think that you're going to be in the perfect place to look at this. And understanding that in the Indigenous market, we've been encountering these types of issues all along, right? And looking to solutions. So I think we should be looking to our Indigenous business leaders in this space and how we're going to transition into net zero as well. So maybe we can start talking about some of those solutions. What are you seeing? How do you see some of the way forward from your perspective?
Yeah, well, it's, that's exactly the question, right? Is what do we do to remove these barriers, and how do we find solutions on these barriers that also prevent our Indigenous clients from diversifying their economies in a way that is actually supportive of net zero commitments. And, Cherie, I'll just throw it out there, but I think maybe you should consider joining the finance world, because back to my original point, and the reason that for so many years I was on my soapbox about the need for Indigenous people in business and finance is because you get it. And other women who are joining us today on this discussion, they get it as well. They understand the risks, they understand the challenges, they understand the barriers. And that's exactly why we need Indigenous people in every institution, whether they're mainstream financial institutions, whether they're Indigenous owned and operated institutions. But we need our own people to be in positions where they can solve these problems, and no one understands them better than our own people. And here at CIBC, we're making we've obviously made significant commitments toward net zero, and that applies to all lines of business, not just our Indigenous markets team. But there's no better place to start than with our Indigenous markets portfolio, because our Indigenous communities, generally speaking, have always been stewards of the environment. And generally speaking, the projects that they're looking at doing in their communities are projects that are good, sustainable projects that will benefit the community, that will benefit Canada generally, and that will do so in a way that is sustainable. And so we just need to find ways to be innovative and be creative, and to find a way to finance those projects and make sure that we're involving our Indigenous partners.
I can't say it any more than you just have. And the point is, we do have the existing financing models, right? We've done it in the Indigenous space, looking to government guarantees, looking to move away from the strict finance model and enable access to capital. And we're going to have to continue to do it in Indigenous communities for sustainability, but also look to do it broadly across the country as it relates to net zero. So I think you're going to be an amazing place. You already are. And I am working on some of those transactions, and I look to continue to do that too, in whatever capacity I'm in. So super excited to have you here, Jamie. I think we're going to move over to Tabitha. So it is with pleasure that I get to introduce Tabitha Bull, somebody I've known also for quite some time. When I was in the intro statement talking about an engineer, this is our engineer here turned business woman, turned CEO, turned executive. And so it's wonderful to see you in your transitions and see what you bring to your role at the CCAB. So over to you, Tabitha.
Thank you, Cherie. It's nice to be here. Nice to see you. It's interesting to talk about the transitions we've gone through. So I originally went into engineering to support Indigenous communities on energy projects and kind of be that bridge between sustainable, renewable projects, energy projects, past grievances with, our energy industry here, particularly in Ontario at the time. And I did engineering for about 15 years. In the last part of my, what I call my first career, I had the opportunity to work with communities across Ontario on energy projects and also on energy planning. So enabling communities to be able to really think about what they wanted their community to look like in terms of energy, how they wanted to move forward in their own energy space, which to me was something that was so important. We also were able to work on building capacity within communities. So ensuring that communities had an energy champion within their community that could help to support these types of projects that Jamie was talking about, but also be able to respond to the numerous programs that were being rolled out in the province. And, I've talked to some other provinces and communities in other provinces about that work as well. I think, it came to a point in my career where I felt I had done what I could do in that space, and this opportunity came up at CCAB. And I was also really looking to move more nationally and working with communities across the country because my focus had been really in Ontario for some time. So definitely a bit of a departure in moving to business, but I'm still quite involved in the energy world as a board member now in IESO. And I still wholeheartedly believe that energy projects and equity investments and participation in energy projects is a huge opportunity for Indigenous communities to be part of our clean future in the country, and not just an opportunity for communities, but a necessity for governments and for corporate partners and energy producers as well. So happy to be part of this to keep moving that forward.
No, that's great. And it's great to see you in this position and having brought all that knowledge from the energy space, infrastructure space, seeing all those programming levers, and then now taking it to a national perspective. So maybe you can talk about the implementation side, right? With the work that you're doing and how you're collaborating with businesses and trying to help them along their journey.
Sure. So Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business is a membership association. We are nonpartisan as well, but we have both Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses, currently over 1,850 businesses and associations and educational institutions are members of CCAB. So, our mandate has always been to build bridges and make connections between Indigenous and non-Indigenous business and being able to continue to push for growth in the Indigenous economy. Definitely over the last 2 years, a lot of that work has been on advocacy at the government. And part of that was really COVID and ensuring that the supports for businesses were able to meet the needs of Indigenous businesses in particular. And some of what Jamie talked about before, some of those supports that were rolled out, Indigenous businesses, particularly on reserve, were unable to access because of conditions under the Indian Act. So a lot of advocacy around there, but we've seen some real movement and push in that advocacy. So now as we talk about getting to our net zero commitments, as we talk about building back better, we're doing a lot of work to ensure that Indigenous businesses and communities are considered at the forefront of any of those programs to support, not as an afterthought. And then working with our corporate partners on procurement. So procurement from Indigenous business, the opportunity for us to continue to grow the Indigenous economy by supporting Indigenous business, and be that through procurement in your office of your catering or your graphic design, but also as we look to building new projects to meet our net zero targets, how are we ensuring that Indigenous businesses are part of that build? So continuing to work with communities and corporations on help supporting them and building those relationships, and supporting them and looking across their organization at all the ways that they can be supporting communities and businesses and Indigenous employees and Indigenous youth, not just within their equity, diversity, and inclusion department, but across every facet of their organization.
And so you've seen your membership grow incredibly. I feel like in alignment with our interest and focus on ESG, through Corporate Canada, trying to unpack and understand where will different companies fit in the ESG space. And getting a sense that obviously, your membership is growing just at the same time, right? And so are you seeing that businesses are looking to understanding the Indigenous economy and how they can fulfill their sustainability goals?
Yeah, I think we definitely are seeing a real recognition of, TRC 92 and corporations trying to understand what their role is to support Indigenous businesses and what their path is on their journey of reconciliation as a corporation. And definitely as we see ESG becoming something that we're all talking about and disclosures improving on ESG file, I think there's a real recognition that Indigenous business, as Jamie touched on this as well, have had sustainability and social governance within the core of their business from the very beginning. And our research shows that, particularly women-owned businesses, their most important consumer or their most important client is the community, the Indigenous community. And over 85% have some part within their business plan of how they're giving back to support sustainability goals from an environment perspective, or how they're giving back to support community, be that through supporting youth and scholarships, or supporting from an environmental perspective, supporting supports for clean water within communities. So even during COVID, when Indigenous businesses and all businesses were really struggling, we saw a high percentage of businesses that created some new way for them to support community through COVID, be that providing PPE or supporting from transportation perspective. And I think corporations in general are starting to really understand the additional benefits of using Indigenous business and working with Indigenous business. We're also seeing as well a huge uptake in corporations wanting to understand how they can support Indigenous business. And that doesn't mean that they're doing that because they have an impact. So we used to see resource companies that had a direct impact on the environment and on a community, definitely really trying to understand that. But now we're seeing organizations like Uber who are wanting to understand what they can do. And that's a huge new opportunity as we look at urban Indigenous people, as we look at new partnerships and opportunities. So definitely as we move into people kind of waking up to environment and social governance, Indigenous people have been doing that for such a long time that we're seeing that connection even stronger.
No, that's great. And so the membership is diversifying, as you say, right? Moving from the mining companies, the oil and gas companies to other companies in the technology space, other companies looking to understand, what their role will be. So that's great to see. I mean, the other piece to comment on would be good to hear from you too is sort of the back to work or working remotely and that alignment with, often one of the barriers and struggles that we've had within Indigenous communities is that people want to live in their home territory, right? They want an economy, they want sustainability, they also want to be near their grandparents and their traditional homelands and the like. And so maybe you could speak to some of that and some of the innovation you're seeing, which again, just connects back to net zero and great solutions.
Yeah. I think definitely we're seeing a real opportunity as we look at Indigenous youth as the fastest growing population in Canada. There's a huge opportunity for employment here. But we also know that Indigenous youth are more connected to their culture than ever. And so many of us are relearning our culture and our language and rebuilding that community. So there isn't, a huge opportunity for us to look at remote work and communities and people being able to live back in their community, but still work at a bank on Bay Street in Toronto or downtown Vancouver. It also provides a more culturally safe space, right? A lot of, when we're definitely working on this, lots of corporations are working on this, but people need to be able to bring their whole selves to work in order for that diversity to really benefit an organization. So we're seeing that people being able to stay closer to their community and their culture, being better employees, more satisfied employees. So that's huge, but we definitely have a lot of work to do still on broadband infrastructure and high-speed infrastructure in communities if we're going to ensure that employees are able to stay and work in their communities, but be equal opportunity providers and support in the organizations as well.
All right, thanks. Well, let's hope those announcements around broadband and connectivity all come into fruition, and we start to see better connectivity for everyone. Okay, I'm going to move over to Kate Finn, and really excited to hear from you, Kate. Kate is the executive director at First Peoples Worldwide. She's also a lawyer. She has a background, a master's of public administration, and really works for an interesting organization. So before we get into it, it'd be great if you can talk about your organization, and then I can ask you some questions too.
Yes, thank you so much, Cherie, and thank you so much to First Nations Major Project Coalition and to everyone who's putting together this event. I am beyond delighted and honored to be on this panel with so many women, and I share their vision for an Indigenous-led future and an Indigenous-led energy transition. At First Peoples Worldwide, our mission is to work from a foundation of Indigenous values to achieve a sustainable future for all. And I'm so grateful to be the third Indigenous woman to lead this organization. I myself am Osage, and as you mentioned, Cherie, I am an attorney. And what really drives my work here in this space, the finance space, is the fact that there are so many solutions in Native nations, in tribes, and with Native entrepreneurs. And there's a lot of creativity to be had when we look at this intersection of business, law, and finance. And it feels to me like the best conduit for that kind of Indigenous innovation as we move forward in the energy transition.
Oh, that's great. Okay, well, listen, let's get into some questions. Maybe you can talk about, given all the energy transition that's underway, what can we look to in terms of our future ideas for transactions? What kind of past deal making is relevant now?
Yeah, absolutely. So just echoing what Jamie had said earlier, in the United States, Native nations, tribes, and Indigenous entrepreneurs have been subject to waves of racist, frankly, and assimilationist policies that have made it very difficult for local economies to thrive. And those policies were official policies of the federal government for the 18th and 19th centuries. And we're still seeing a lot of those barriers today. And one scholar, eminent scholar in the field, had noted that as the federal government removed Native nations from traditional territories, we were placed far away. We were made invisible, and that was called a measured separatism. And that's true in the economic systems as well. And so we're still kind of reaping the consequences of Native economic invisibility. But I think what I'm so excited about in terms of this energy transition is that while Native nations, while entrepreneurs have been somewhat invisible in the larger markets, they haven't been still. There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of expertise, there's a lot of business acumen in those communities, and I think we can move forward and disrupt those past patterns and elevate that Indigenous expertise. And I think, the past patterns that I point to most frequently are those where, deal making was very inequitable, such that benefits were enjoyed by the businesses outside of the community, but not enjoyed by the tribes, and be those economic benefits or otherwise. I think it's time that we create a more equitable table for Native nations and Indigenous entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear your perspective on it, and seeing a lot of parallels, obviously, with the Canadian experience. And so I'm looking forward to our discussion more on some examples and where we can start to see how those examples might be helpful into the U.S. context, and then examples in your country being helpful in the Canadian context. So maybe let's talk over to equity then, right? Thinking about equity in finance and your views on FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, and how are you seeing that translate into finance?
Absolutely. So, and again, I'll just reflect what Tabitha had said about the fact that Indigenous peoples really, we invest according to our values, and that's been true for a long time. And now there's a real alignment with those who wish to invest according to ESG criteria and even impact investing. And so I think that there's a real alignment there to develop a capital stack for Native nations and for Native entrepreneurs that is value aligned at every part of the capital stack. And in fact, we did at First Peoples Worldwide a report in 2020 on private equity and the ways that private equity could be deployed well. And we used free, prior, and informed consent as a pivotal aspect of understanding private equity, because free, prior, and informed consent in the international context, it's really about participation rights and decision-making rights. And so what we did is we went into this research with that core value that Native nations deserve and have rights to both of those things, and have values through which they want to invest and be invested in. So what we found is that oftentimes when private equity deals occur in Indian country, they're one-off deals. There's not a lot of learning from deal to deal about what worked, what didn't work, who has a majority stake, who has a minority stake, how did the tribes benefit, did they benefit, did this deal work well? So the fact that it's one-off deals every time really showed us that there's a need to start capturing learning and capturing understanding from each of these deals, so that can be translated as more and more Native nations seek larger capital infusions. So I think there's a need for new models of deal making in that way. And another thing that we learned along the way is that really, and this was a value more than the learning, any investment in Indian country is an impact investment. Because of the policies of the past and the way that invisibility has really influenced local economies, there's a real opportunity for impact investors and those who have goals that align with social and economic goals to invest here and to elevate ingenuity in Indian country. And what we think in terms of specific examples, it's more than just placing a wind turbine and then after 10 years a tribe owning a piece of infrastructure that doesn't really work anymore. It's about saying tribes and Native nations get more than rents. It's their resources that they're putting on the table, and they should be remunerated equitably in that way. So it's really about looking at these past deals that were done, maybe in the oil and gas sector and others, and picking them apart, understanding where they can be better, and moving forward in that different way.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I mean, I think about the Canadian context, the Ontario context, and you sort of mentioned the idea of the one-off deals. For sure, we would have that same situation. But, the work that Tabitha was involved in and myself on the energy side, renewable energy side, it was trying to create a policy that would enable participation from an equity perspective. So not just leases, right? Not just rents, but enable Indigenous communities to participate in projects, also not just within the territories of their nations, but anywhere in Ontario. So really looking to see how do we take that policy, enable equity, and then look to what kind of capacity building will come from that, while at the same time putting in access to capital, own source revenues for those nations. And so, you look at that list, and that was a huge list of objectives. Query, how we're doing, right? It's not, there's a lot of objectives to fulfill there. I believe that we actually still had the right ingredients there. It's now to bring more interest in the space, broaden it beyond, renewable, but areas of value-driven investment, not just seek to look inside the community for investment, but look beyond, Ontario. We've got other nations that are, looking across Canada and North America for their investments. So I think we do have the pieces, and I feel like, back again, it's the net zero market, it's the climate change, market that should be looking to these tools, right? And then obviously the job's not done on our end. We're still looking to make sure that we have real, meaningful partnerships, right? Listen, I think we're going to move over to some questions. We've got some questions that were coming in from everybody, and it's so good to hear from all of you. You've really set the stage on all these topics that we want to get covered off here today. So let me take a look at what we have here from questions that are coming in from the group. So I think people are wanting to see some examples of success, asking about how are organizations' ESG strategies and commitments being measured against success is a question. So maybe I open it up to who wants to jump on with that question first.
I can talk a bit about our PAR program, which is a program that really focuses on Indigenous relations, and corporations work on Indigenous relations. And as I spoke about before, it's not just about what is in your EDI department, but it looks across your whole organization at business development. So what are you doing from an equity position, supporting partnerships potentially with Indigenous businesses? What's your strategy around Indigenous procurement? Potentially mentorship for Indigenous business. It looks at employment. So what are you doing specifically to not just to hire a certain number of Indigenous employees, but what are you doing to ensure that there's cultural awareness training across your whole organization? What are you doing to see how there's succession planning, and an opportunity for not just retention of Indigenous employees, but promotion as well. And then definitely community relations. So what communities, depending, as I said, if it's Uber and it's an urban Indigenous people versus if you're, really in a community and you have a community partner, and then leadership actions. And the key part of this program is that you have 3 years as an organization to look across your organization at what the opportunities are, and then to start to set your intentions with respect to what you can actually achieve, and then put those into place. And then we have independent Indigenous verifiers that go into the organization and assess how you've met those commitments. So really measuring, if you have a procurement target, you really need to demonstrate this is the amount of money we have spent with Indigenous businesses. And looks across, and we also then interview the communities that you're working with, speak to the executive team, and speak to employees. And then there's a recommendation on a certification level that also goes to an independent Indigenous group of jurors who will then recommend a certification for the business. And this, to me, it's not specifically on ESG, but there's so much conversation about where the I fits in ESG. Is it ESGI, or is there I within ESG? And I think, our relationships as businesses and corporations and as people with Indigenous communities and Indigenous people is unique as constitutionally rights holders. It needs to be a separate focus and a real focus put strategically on relationship with Indigenous people. And the other thing is that there is a real commitment and a measurement. It's not as simple as signing a declaration or signing a commitment that certifies that you're looking at gender equity, as an example. There really has to be tangible action taken and measurement against that action. And I think as we start to see ESG disclosures come, that's something that I'll be definitely looking for, is where are the actual numbers and measurement, and how are we ensuring that the targets that are being set are having the impact that we require.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Tabitha, right? We know there's so many different methods right now of measuring sustainability, right? As you were saying, and but we also know there's a global push to have a singular methodology, right? And this Mark Carney and others are looking for us to all get to that place. And while that is obviously ideal, simplification's better. But I feel like what I'm hearing from you is there still need to have the qualitative analysis as well, right? And I think where people talk a lot about metrics and targeting, it's great to be able to have that measurement from a numbers perspective. But I think we also have to ensure that we're having measurement from a qualitative perspective, right? And being able to see that impact. Sometimes the numbers just won't be enough. In some cases. So, all right. So maybe we just continue on with our question. Yeah, why don't you jump in, Kate?
If I may, to that point, I think, and I agree that, in fact, the Indigenous part of ESG needs to be its own focus for a number of different reasons. Indigenous peoples around the world, of course, are subject to different statuses in their regime, in their legal regime in each country. And I think to the extent that companies can agree on disclosure metrics that measure their impact on and for Indigenous peoples, so much the better for folks who may not have access to civil or political rights, or even just basic economic rights in their jurisdiction. And I also think, part and parcel of the disclosure conversation is a conversation around due diligence. Are companies really performing due diligence against metrics that measure Indigenous rights? Have they, in fact, secured consent from communities that are impacted? And by impacted, I mean positive and negative, any impact. Is there a relationship there? How are they measuring that relationship? With whom? What modern reservation territories are different than treaty territories? How are they measuring that? How are they identifying communities? They're big questions, but I really believe that complexity is not an excuse for inaction. And I know there's so much great work being done to develop these disclosures and due diligence, and it's a great moment to take a step forward and to see what we can develop quantitatively and qualitatively, and then iterate from there.
And if I could, Cherie, maybe jump in and just round out the. Sorry, I have so much to say. I know there are other questions, but to follow up on what Tabitha said. Tabitha, as you know, CIBC is undergoing the PAR process right now, and so we've committed to that process, which I think is a really important process to work through, exactly to this point, for tracking purposes, but also for action purposes. Because the steps and the metrics within the PAR certification program are a really, really great guide for us to do better as an organization. We're committed to doing that. And for those of you that are interested on how we track and report on our progress at CIBC on our ESG commitments, I would invite you to review our 2021 ESG report that was just released just a week or so ago. So that is the most up-to-date disclosure we've released on how we're doing as tracking against our commitments as a financial institution. And of course, many of you will know that just late last year, CIBC, of course, committed to the net zero 2050 target, and also announced a commitment to mobilizing more sustainable finance with a commitment of $300 billion by 2030 in the sustainable finance space specifically. So just a bit on what we're doing to meet our targets and how we measure those targets.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Jamie. The just to also add to what you were saying too, Kate, like I think we should have a good discussion on this as well, right? It comes back to, how our proponents, how our developers looking to ensure that they are developing projects within communities that are benefiting the communities in which they're operating in, right? That are looking to have lasting benefits. Beyond being good neighbors, complying with the aspirations around UNDRIP, right? Complying with the aspirations around FPIC, and how we're going to end up seeing that into our legislation in Canada. Very much looking forward to seeing how those aspirations get implemented in law. But it's interesting. What I'm sort of seeing is another way that we're looking to approach it is, why not be proactive? Why not just sort of look at the law as the minimum standard, right? There's no reason why we can't go above and beyond the current legal standard. That should just be seen as the minimum, right? And I, just sort of drawing some parallels in what you're talking about, I feel like I've heard as well in the climate space, right? Companies are looking to understand from a climate perspective, are they doing well, right? And beyond looking to our measurements in sustainability, but just really trying to check that. So it's interesting that you're suggesting that there is another way to do that in the Indigenous due diligence space, right? Independent verification on that from a due diligence perspective. So I think that's great. What else? Are we seeing other examples? Maybe Jamie, you can talk about, Tabitha, other examples where we're seeing companies do things proactively, look to create proactive strategic relationships.
Jamie,
yeah, sorry, I didn't want to talk over Tabitha if she was going to jump in on that one, but we're definitely seeing it from the finance space in terms of the opportunities that are coming to us from our clients and the types of projects that they're looking to partner on and be involved with. And I mean, particularly, there's more opportunity now than there ever has been in the past on the financing side for these kinds of projects, because with our commitment that I just mentioned to sustainable finance and growing our book of business in that space, the time is now. The support for sustainable opportunities is so great across so many industries, and just the move generally towards thinking about the ESG elements of everything that we do. In our commitment at CIBC towards net zero for 2050, that is in both our operations and our financing. So to some extent, obviously, it's easier to meet a net zero target of 2050 in our own operations. That's something that's entirely within our control. But in terms of our financing activities, that means we need to work with partners who have the same commitments that we do, who are committed to achieve the same goals that we are, because that's where we're directing a significant part of our funding and our portfolio over the next 10 years, at least.
Right, and CIBC would be along with other banks and the Global Finance Alliance for Net Zero, and looking to bring all those large pools of dollars towards energy transitions projects, right? And so I don't know, Tabitha, if you wanted to talk about some examples.
I think one example I just wanted to touch on, it's not specifically in the energy transition, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for that support, and that's in shareholder and investment decisions. So we've recently seen shareholders put forward resolutions with respect to Indigenous reconciliation. So For example, TMX, the shareholders of TMX put forward a resolution for TMX to develop an Indigenous inclusion strategy and for TMX to begin to make commitments around procurement from Indigenous business. And it was voted in favor 98% of shareholders. So I think as shareholders in these large corporations, there's a real opportunity for that push as well, for shareholders to put forward resolutions that encourage organizations to look for partners at the outset. And I think that's a really great example of where we're seeing movement happen. And TMX has responded incredibly well and quickly on moving forward. And we've really seen some action there because of that push from the shareholder community. And I think that's a real opportunity that we'll be able to see more action created from in the future.
Right. So it's coming back to stakeholders, right? To shareholders as stakeholders in the companies, and then to the companies wanting to see their aspirations as well, right? And hearing that it's not just about the bottom line from a financial perspective, but really wanting to see these lasting relationships. And so maybe we can look to think of some other examples. I don't know, Kate, if you can add in some examples from the U.S. side. We have a question here on looking for examples on the Indigenous energy transition solutions that have worked well on the U.S. scale that you think might be transferable over here.
Absolutely. So I think, I like to say, in Canada, you all are so much further ahead in terms of UNDRIP implementation. And further on the eye in a lot of ways. So, it's really just about finding the ways to combine the best of both and drive solutions because, we know that Indigenous solutions don't have borders, right? So how can we combine? The example that I would point to today in particular to the energy transition is, as many people know, the Navajo Nation is the largest territory in the U.S. that is still only Indigenous. It's the largest reservation in the U.S. And they've been going through a just transition in real time. When folks talk about what would a just transition look like, what will it be, let's look at Navajo. They've had incredible changes to climate and weather, but they've also had the decommissioning of coal and uranium mines, which have stranded local communities in terms of their jobs and their workforce. But they're also seeing incredible development in terms of renewable energy. And they were poised in a way that's really remarkable to respond to energy policies of states. So the state of California has set a goal to receive, I believe it's upwards of 50% of their energy from renewable sources by 2030. And the Navajo Nation signed a deal with the city of Los Angeles to provide energy from renewable sources to the city. And that just, to me, is a huge way that tribes are able to be part of these larger deals, respond to state and federal policies in an innovative way, and provide new levers for economic development and innovation along the way.
That is an incredible example, and I'm thinking of projects that are outside the GTA that could, if come to fruition, would be in a perfect place to be providing energy solutions, renewable energy storage solutions to the Greater Toronto area. I think we still have some barriers, though, in the in our electricity system in terms of in Ontario facilitating a private power purchase agreement environment. So I think Alberta enjoys a lot more flexibility there. So I think if the takeaway is how do we create more flexibility in Canadian solutions, it sounds like those would be amazing outcomes.
And if I may very quickly, this is why I love this brain trust that we have this morning, because it's these deals that we can share. I think that there's so much commonality between the two, and why can't we share what's working and what's not? This is a great deal that the Navajo Nation is championing, and there's still lots of questions about who has the infrastructure on the ground, what are the power rates that communities in Navajo are paying? How do we build an EV infrastructure if, in fact, the world is moving to EVs, and bring along Indigenous territories as well? So I'm just so thrilled to be a part of this and to really put the deal-making structures on the table for use by everybody.
That sounds like
Yeah,
the potential for a future FNMPC event like this, because I guarantee you, I'm super interested to hear more about that particular deal and how it came to be and how they made it work, and I bet a lot of the audience is as well. So maybe I'll just throw that out there, that sign me up if there's a future event exploring that project.
Well, and I think there's kind of a theme here too, right? Like the Navajo are doing it because there's no one else to figure it out except for them, right? Like they have the self-determination and the interest to come up with the solutions. They may also have, in some ways, some, when we say we have barriers, sometimes it also gives an opportunity too, right? The lack of legislation might also pave the way for some innovative solutions. And I've kind of felt the same way too when we're looking at our Indigenous communities and the real need to create sustainable economies that go beyond, communities that have homes and schools, but communities that have homes and schools and businesses and have all that diversity that makes them wholly sustainable. And so I do think that we're going to have more examples of where Indigenous communities are just looking to solve their own solutions, and we will graft them into the broader net zero agenda, right? And task, right? So I'm super excited for that. Somebody's asked us, what can men do in organizations to better support and encourage more female leadership? So obviously female leadership into sustainable business and finance, and I have some thoughts, but I'm just wondering, what do you guys think?
I think any man who's asking that question is already doing the right things. It shows an openness and a willingness and an enlightenment, a real allyship. Right, that's what we need from our male colleagues and clients, and we just need your allyship. We're quite capable. Clearly, all of the women on this call are capable of achieving great things in their careers. I'm sure, while balancing a whole bunch of other commitments in life and at home. But what we just need is support. We need support. We need opportunity, and that's it, right? Women's issues are not. They're not just women's issues, they're everyone's issues. And that should be the attitude that we approach questions of career advancement for women and gender equality and equal opportunity, in my view.
Well said.
Yeah, for sure.
I think the other, we all have a tendency to listen to the people who we feel we're most similar to. I think we all need to check ourselves a little bit. So if you're in a meeting and you leave a meeting, think about who did you really listen to in that meeting, and who did you maybe doodle when they were talking? Check to see, did everybody in the meeting have an opportunity to say something and to add to the conversation? And if not, invite them to add. There are times where people can be spoken over or interrupted, and it gets tiring to be the one who might say, I wasn't finished yet. So, as an ally, it's super helpful for someone to say, actually, I don't think you were finished yet. Could you finish your comment? Let's give you an opportunity to finish your comment. There's little things like that go a long way to ensuring that everybody's voice around the table is able to be heard. And we all have a role to play to ensure that we're making that space for everybody to provide their commentary and provide their input. I think the other thing is really this panel is specifically meant to be women on the panel, but there are still so many times where there may be a panel of 6 people and one woman. We need to ensure that we're doing our best to hear all voices in conferences and in opportunities like this as well. So I think real intentionality around that is important.
Well, listen, we're getting close to the end of our session. We got 1 minute left, and I want to close it with a statement that if I needed to solve a sustainable business and finance solution, I would want to have Indigenous leaders. I would want to have Indigenous female leaders. I would want to have those leaders who, among all of you, have made your way to the place you are right now. You're all executives. You're all in the C-suite. You've had to do so much to get there, and it was by changing the status quo. It wasn't by following along. You know, you had to find solutions. So if I want anybody on my team, it would be all of you. So love you guys. And listen, it's been a great discussion, and I know we're all going to get to see each other in just the end of the month in Vancouver, where we're just going to pick this up again. So I want to say thank you so much to all of our attendees. Again, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Tabitha. Thank you, Kate. Just such thoughtful ideas, and you know, we really are going to be in good shape with all of you ladies in the future in this space. And so thank you to the First Nations Major Projects Coalition and everybody, all of our sponsors, and we look forward to seeing you, and please join us at the end of April out in Vancouver. Thank you.